This is a Rubik's Cube. Some people believe that the more intelligent you are, the quicker you're going to be able to solve something like this. Well, what if I was to tell you that while I speak to you about what's in this episode, I was going to solve this without even looking at it? Would you believe me? Well, over the course of this particular episode of Changing Minds, I'm going to walk you through not only the history of intelligence and what intelligence really means and what it measures, but also specific strategies that you can learn about how you can start to become smarter, how you can use your brain better and be even more effective so you can become smarter than everyone else. And if you bet against me at the start, you would have been correct. I'm terrible at these. Useless. It's nothing to do with intelligence, though. I swear. Welcome to another episode of the Changing Minds podcast. I'm Owen Fitzpatrick, and today we are not going to be talking about Rubik's Cubes, that's for sure. But what we will be talking about is intelligence. And in this particular episode, what I want to do is I want to break down for you exactly what we mean when we talk about intelligence and give you specific strategies that you can use to become smarter than everybody else. Now, I know that's a bit of a clickbaity type title. I will ask for forgiveness because, look, it's not going to be that you're smarter than everybody else. But my aim is for you to be smarter than you already are, if that works. So I still think it's worth it. Now, when I say smarter than you already are, I'm assuming you're smart. You know why? Because you're tuning into this podcast. And the fact that you're watching or listening to this podcast right now is evidence that you're one of the smartest people out there. There's a lot of dummies, a lot of stupid people out there that aren't listening to this podcast right now, but you are, which puts you in the category of really, really intelligent people. And I'm going to do my best to offer you strategies that you can use to become even smarter than you already are. And we'll do so by, first of all, looking at intelligence as a term, some of the other terms that we often associate with it, like being wise or being clever or being smart. We'll then look at some of the factors that are correlated with intelligence. What are the kind of advantages that you have if you are smarter than the average bear? Then we're going to be looking at the neuroscience of intelligence. What are the kinds of things that happen to our brains when we become smarter? And we will dive into the history of intelligence. Oh, I'm telling you, I can't wait for this. We're going to be looking back to what people used to think intelligence was, and we're going to be going all the way through from ancient times right the way through to the present day, figuring out how did you measure intelligence, all to serve the most important part of the entire episode, which is through a number of different strategies that you can use immediately, practically, on a regular, consistent basis to become smarter than you already are. So let's start by looking at, well, what is intelligence? And intelligence can be seen as a cognitive ability to do a number of things. It's the ability to learn from experience, the ability to be able to adapt to new situations, the ability to be able to conceptualize abstract concepts, to use knowledge to manipulate your environment, to use reason effectively, to remember things, and to be able to use that information in an effective way, solve problems effectively, or make great decisions. All of those are examples of the kinds of skills that really make up intelligence. Now, when you hear the term knowledgeable or well-informed, that really means that you've got a lot of information or knowledge. And then wise is your ability to apply that knowledge in a way that gets you the results that you want. It's sort of like something that comes with experience. When we talk about clever, we're really talking about a form of intelligence that is really connected to your ability to understand things that are complex. And when we talk about smart, we're really talking about the ability that you have to make great decisions. Finally, when we look at what a genius means, what a genius means is really someone who stands out for their creative or intellectual excellence in some way. They're outstanding in that way. It's like, why was the Scarecrow awarded a very important award? Because they were outstanding in their field. It's an old one, but a good one. So as we go through and we look at these different definitions, the next question we need to ask is, so what, right? Well, why should we even bother trying to become smarter? You might think to yourself, well, Owen, why should I become more intelligent? What's the point in listening to this episode and learning these great ideas that you have to share that will help me to be smarter? Well, let me tell you this. First of all, although the research does suggest that what we call IQ, 50 to 80% at least, tends to be genetic, that still means there's between 20 and 50% of your intelligence you can work at, you can develop, and you can make better. And so I really encourage you to be focusing on it. And the reasons are because, first of all, the more intelligent you are, the more likely you are to do better in education. I mean, that's the obvious one. The more likely you are to do better economically. So you're more likely to make more money over the course of your life. You're more likely to be healthier over the course of your life as well and live longer as a result of being more intelligent. So there's a whole host of different advantages that you'll tend to have the smarter that you are. Now, we have to be aware that there are circumstantial factors that are involved. You can be born into circumstances, and indeed you are born into circumstances that will determine how clever you are likely to become. Because once again, the circumstances that surround you will very much impact how your intellectual capacities are developed over the period of your childhood and that kind of thing. So circumstances do indeed matter. And it's also important to realize that being smart does have its downside as well. For example, people who are extremely smart tend to be overthinkers. I mean, I overthink a lot. I'm like a total overthinker. I'm constantly thinking too much, right? And I suppose, yeah, that might make me extremely smart. Okay, thank you. Another thing is that you're more likely to be a perfectionist if you are very intelligent. But being a perfectionist has its negative sides as well. It can be very stressful, and you can constantly feel not good enough because you're not holding yourself up to the same standards as you want to be holding yourself up to. Also, one of the factors that we do know about being intelligent is that sometimes it can make us feel more isolated. And I can certainly relate to that. And I think it's because when you're so intelligent, it's hard for you to relate to other people. For example, the other day, I had asked my friends if they wanted to go out, and they said, no, we got to brush our hair. And I said, but I'll pay for everyone. And they said, no, we'd still prefer to stay at home. And I said, well, I could come over. And they said, no, we'd prefer if you didn't. And that's probably because they're so intimidated by my intelligence. So they're like, oh, if Owen comes over, it's going to be too stimulating. And so we have to deal with that kind of isolation. And it's tough, but it's again a bit of evidence that suggests that I'm super smart. And then finally, there's also the tendency to introspect, the tendency to go inside your mind and think a little bit different to overthinking. Introspection is really getting too lost inside your own thoughts. But on a more serious note, unfortunately, a lot of the times, people who are struggling with things like depression or anxiety do tend to be extremely smart. And it's because they have a depth to emotion or a depth to feeling that sometimes can lead them in the wrong direction. They're thinking so much that they're actually creating sort of catastrophes in their own mind and struggling with their own mental health as a result. So it is something to be cautious of, that being smart is not the be all and end all. And sometimes the smarter you are, the more you think yourself into a hole. So it's important to not just become smarter, but become smarter about how you're smart. See what I did there? You need to be smarter at being smart. So not just smart for the sake of it, but smart in a new direction, a direction that allows you to solve the kinds of problems you need to, as opposed to being too internally philosophical or whatnot. Let's get into the neuroscience, the brain science of intelligence. So with the brain, one of the interesting findings about the study of the brain when it comes to intelligence is that the more intelligent the person is, the more they've found more what we call gray matter. Now, the brain typically has lots of what we call white matter, and gray matter is actually crucial for processing in the brain, mental processing of different things. In 3 parts of the brain, it has been shown that there's definitely a correlation between those parts operating quite efficiently and effectively and our intelligence. They're the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, and the temporal lobe. Temporal lobe is more to do with our memories. The parietal lobe is more to do with our spatial reasoning and that kind of thing. And the frontal lobe is, of course, the seat of what we call the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for a lot of the decisions we make, a lot of the problems that we solve, all that sort of gist. And we finally have what we call the brain efficiency hypotheses. And this is really the idea that the smarter you are, the faster your brain works and the more efficiently your brain works. So you use a lot less energy in order to be able to get the kind of results that someone who wouldn't be as smart as you would be able to use. Now, the reason I bring up the neuroscience is because I want you to understand that a lot of the work that we'll be talking about later is really about boosting what we call your neuroplasticity. This means your brain's ability to learn and make new connections. And as you do that, you're making your brain more efficient. As you do that, you're activating your frontal, temporal, and parietal cortexes more effectively. And as you do that, you're increasing the amount of gray matter in your brain. And that's really what we're looking for. But before we get into the actual, this is what you need to do, let's talk history, shall we? I know what you're thinking. You're thinking to yourself, oh my goodness, Owen, out of everything that I've ever wanted to listen to, I want to hear you tell me about the history of intelligence. Well, I got good news for you. That's what we're doing right now. And we will start with the wonderful Plato. Plato had this notion. He talked about the three parts of the soul and whatnot, and he always claimed that the rational part of the soul was the best. He called the ultimate type of leader, the ones that he said should only be leading society, what he called philosopher kings. And these are people that are super smart. Aristotle, his student, came along afterwards, and Aristotle said, yo, Plato, hey, chill, bro. I'm pretty sure he didn't talk like that, but if he was talking like that, that's probably what he would say. And he said, listen, bro, you need to understand that intelligence is much more about what you see in the outside. You take from the world, and what you do is you extract observations, general principles from what you observe. He talked about two types of wisdom, what he called theoretical wisdom and also practical wisdom. And theoretical wisdom is your ability to understand things, but practical wisdom is your ability to be more, as he would call it, virtuous, right? Being good, making good, ethical, responsible, moral decisions. And then a few years later, in fact, a couple of millennia later, we had the Renaissance, of course, and that was people like Leonardo da Vinci, the polymath, the legend. He's like, does everything well. He's one of those kinds of people that you look him up on Instagram and he's like, oh, look at what I just painted. And then he's like, oh, I just invented the plane. The only thing he didn't invent was time travel. So Da Vinci showing off on his Instagram feed would be something that just wouldn't come across very, very well in today's world, I'm sure. But it was another example of this notion that there's lots of different ways in which you can be intelligent. When we then got to the Enlightenment, you have dudes like John Locke, who talked about what he called, we're all born with a tabula rasa, which is a blank slate. He said, you're born and you got like an empty brain, right? And I know people that 20 years after they were born, 30 years, 40 years, they still got empty brains, if you know what I'm saying. But he talked about the taboo. I'm not going to mention that anymore. I'm just going to call it the blank slate. And he said, we're all born with a blank slate. And this blank slate takes on information from the get-go. So as soon as we're born, our brain's like downloading information. And so it's really important to ensure that you've got the right surroundings. And if you've got a child, make sure you surround them with all the good stuff so that they're learning. If you then look at some of the other thinkers like Voltaire, or you look at Diderot, they also talked about the importance of making sure that you share wisdom. You try to create more and more intelligent people because they saw it as a great way of combating problems at the time like tyranny. We don't have any problems with tyranny at the moment. Oh, no. Don't mention it. Don't mention it. Don't mention it. And superstition as well. So they felt that us spreading the word, spreading the wisdom, spreading the intelligence was a great way of being able to do that. Then we get into the late 19th and early 20th century, and this is when we start to go, okay, we need to measure this, right? It's well and good, but think about it. Before the 19th century, people could just go around and go, hey, by the way, super smart. And you couldn't argue with them. You could go, no, I don't think you are. Yeah, super smart. Why? Because we didn't measure it. But all of a sudden, this guy called Francis Galton came along and he goes, hey, let's measure it. He's actually the same person responsible for surveys and questionnaires. If you've ever filled out a survey or questionnaire, this dude is responsible. Don't worry, he's dead. He died like a long time ago. But still, he's the person responsible for the surveys and questionnaires. And actually, a lot of great information has come from those surveys and questionnaires. Galton was great. He decided using statistics, he would figure out what's the average sort of mental age, that kind of thing. He had some issues. He thought that you could actually measure intelligence and it was correlated with certain physical, the size of parts of your anatomy, for example. I think probably it was like the size of your head determines how smart you are or something. When I was in school, people used to tease me because I had quite a big head for the size of my body and hurt at the time. But looking back, maybe Galton was onto something. I mean, the science doesn't back it up. I mean, the science suggests that it's not correlated at all. But, you know, I had a big head. People said it. Maybe. Just throwing it out. I'm just asking questions. I'm not making any statements. I'm just asking questions. So you never know. I mean, we do know, but you never know. Then after Galton, we had a guy called Alfred Binet. And Alfred Binet was commissioned by the French government to try to figure out how could you identify students that needed special education. And he joined up with a guy called Theodore Simon. And together they created a sort of intelligence test in 1905, which was called the Binet-Simon Intelligence Test. And it really emphasized that it wasn't a case of how much knowledge you have. It's more a case of your ability to solve problems, your ability to have a good memory, your ability to pay attention to things. And so that became a really, really good and very popular form of measuring intelligence. And just a few years after that, a guy called Louis Terman came along and said, we can do better, boys. We can do better. And rejigged it into what it was then called the Stanford Binet intelligence scales. Now that immediately makes me think to myself, what did Simon think of all of this, right? You have your name on an intelligence test with your buddy, Binet, everything's good. And then this other third party comes along and calls it the Stanford Binet intelligence test. How can you compete with a university? I would be pissed if I was Simon. Poor guy. But anyway, this Stanford Binet intelligence test was the first time we learned about this concept called IQ, intelligence quotient. And IQ is basically your mental age over your chronological age multiplied by 100. And it became the standardized way of measuring intelligence. They also started to do longitudinal studies where they'd study a person over their lifetime, which is why we know now more about being intelligent tends to be correlated with better educational results and more money over your lifetime and health and all that sort of jazz. David Wechsler was the final person that sort of came along with a sort of a measure of intelligence in what was known as the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. And this became quite popular because it didn't just look at nonverbal reasoning, it also looked at verbal reasoning as well. But that brings us to the fact that intelligence, there's a lot of arguments over this notion of IQ, because, well, let's face it, I'm sure you know a lot of people, I certainly do, that are very intelligent, like very high IQ, not the brightest candles on the cake, right? They're kind of dumb, right? And they're smart, but they're dumb. You know what I'm talking about. You know what I mean. Right? They'll do really well on exams and tests, but they've got no what we call an Ireland cop on or no street smarts whatsoever. So with that in mind, how do you identify the difference between them? And a guy called Howard Gardner came along. He wasn't a gardener, right? It's just his name. But Howard Gardner came along and he wrote a book called Frames of Mind in the 80s, in 1983 or so. And he said, look, there's 8 types of intelligence. And the first one is what he called linguistic intelligence. And this is really your ability to articulate yourself using like lots of wonderful words and language. Then there's the logical, mathematical type of intelligence, which is, I suppose, a little bit closer to IQ. You also have music intelligence, how good you are with picking up an instrument and all that. You got bodily intelligence. This is something I'm terrible at. I'm very clumsy. But bodily intelligence, your ability to move and your ability to dance and stuff would be part of, I suppose, bodily and music to a degree. Spatial intelligence is what architects are really, really great and known for. Interpersonal intelligence, which is really about your ability to be intelligent with other people. One of the parts of emotional intelligence, really. You've got intrapersonal intelligence, which is more about your intelligence about yourself and your own self-awareness and your ability to regulate your own emotions. And finally, a new one he added, an 8th one, which was a sort of a naturalistic type intelligence, your intelligence about the natural world. And another guy called Sternberg, Robert Sternberg, came along as well and talked about 3 types of intelligence, where he said there's analytical, right? Very similar to IQ. There's creative, your ability to solve problems, and then there's practical, right, which is more the street smarts. So I throw all that at you, and I add to that, lastly, emotional intelligence, which was made popular, wasn't invented, but made popular by Daniel Goleman, your ability to be self-aware, manage your own emotions, be more socially aware, build better relationships, and as part of that, of course, the social intelligence. And you got all of these things. And it begs the question, well, with all of these different factors, what is it we need to do? So there's really 5 things I'm going to walk you through here that will help you to become smarter. And the first thing is mindset. The work of Carol Dweck, Professor Carol Dweck from Stanford University, identified this notion of mindset, which is really that the beliefs that you have about how intelligent you are, or the beliefs you have about your ability, will play a large part in determining how likely you are to improve that ability. And she found that people have two types of beliefs about their intelligence. Some people have what she called a fixed mindset. This means they believe that this is how smart I am and I will never improve. Other people have what she calls a growth mindset. And they're people who believe that they can work on their intelligence. In fact, every single person listening to this right now is someone that has a growth mindset. How do I know? Because you would not watch or listen to a podcast which tells you how to become smarter if you didn't believe that you could become smarter. See how smart that is? So you've got a growth mindset, at least in this area when it comes to your intelligence. But she found that people with the growth mindset, people who believe that they can improve their intelligence, are significantly more likely to. And not only that, but they're more likely to be healthier, likely to live longer, more likely to have better relationships, all sorts of positive benefits that you can accrue as a result of believing that you can improve your intelligence and you can improve your ability. Now, how do you do that? Well, again, the notion is that you put in effort, you work hard, you learn how to do it, you take feedback, and this growth mindset propels you towards becoming smarter, solving more problems, tackling whatever challenges that you might face, being able to grit through it all and come out the other side better as a result. So the growth mindset is crucial. If you believe you can improve, if you believe that you're smarter, that will help you to become smarter as well. And there's another related concept to this, which came from a study done by Rosenthal and Jacobson in 1968 or so, where what they did was they went into a school and they told the teachers that there were certain students in the school that were in the class that were intellectual bloomers. And the teachers learned about the particular children that were intellectual bloomers. And a year later, they came back and studied the children who they'd previously studied their IQ. And they found that the children that they told the teachers that these children had this intellectual bloomer label, those children had a significant increase in their IQ from the year before to the year after, which suggested that the teacher's expectations of the students actually influenced how intelligent the student was able to become. So their intelligence improved significantly as a direct result of the way in which the teachers treated them, which is fascinating. This is also known as the Pygmalion effect, which is named after the Greek sculptor. And he sculpted a statue and fell in love with the statue that he sculpted. I mean, there's people now that fall in love with robots, believe robots will talk back to you. Statues, I mean, don't get me wrong, it'd be a quiet life. I mean, if you're in a relationship with a statue, not many arguments are going to be happening, right? You know, they're not going to be like, oh, I can't believe you said that. And if you feel angry, you can shout at them. They're not going to respond. So yeah, that's something to think about. But yeah, so this guy anyway, he created a statue, fell in love with it. And as a result of that, the gods, I think at the time said, you know what, feel sorry for you, mate. I'm going to make the statue come to life. Right. I'm thinking of him, you know, he's in love with the statue. It's all a quiet life. This is great. We never get into any arguments. As soon as the statue comes to life, it's a nightmare. It's like, oh, they won't shut up. I wish they were a statue again. Anyway, the point is, what's my point? I don't even remember what I was talking about. Oh yeah, the Pygmalion effect. So it's known as the Pygmalion effect because it's almost like you fall in love with the potential of a person, you make it come alive because of the way you treat it. So that's really, I suppose, points in the direction of how powerful our beliefs are, our mindset is when it comes to how smart we are. The next thing is training. And this is really mental training. This could be working on your cognitive skills, like practice problem solving. This could be working on your memory, right? Your working memory, practicing, trying to remember different things. The challenges with those are a lot of times those interventions, they tend to be great, but they tend to be great for that specific skill. So you can train it up very well, but it's not always as easy to generalize the skill. So you could work really hard in your memory, let's say for numbers, but that doesn't necessarily cross over to remembering names, for instance. So it really is very contextual in that context. So we have to be as clear as possible. And we'll talk in a little while about how to contextualize this more effectively to make it better. But there are certain evidence-based practices that have been shown to help us be better at retaining information, things that will really help you to be better moving forward whenever you study. The first is spaced repetition. This means when you study something and you create spaces between it, so you study it today, then maybe tomorrow, then maybe a week from now, then maybe a month from now. When you engage in spaced repetition, the research shows you're much more likely to remember that information long term. So as opposed to just cramming, give yourself some space between your different study intervals. Similarly, there's this notion of what we call interweaving, and this is really when you're not just studying one thing, but you're studying a multitude of different topics. Again, when you do that, the research shows you're more likely to remember it down the line. Now, I would caution you with this because if you're dealing with something really complex or you're working on something that requires a lot of mental effort, you're much better served by what we call deep work. And this is a term popularized by Cal Newport, where you allocate 2-3 hours or so just on one thing and you focus 100% on it. But for things that aren't quite as complex and things that you want to be able to learn long term, interleaving, which is really your ability to learn different subjects, move from subject to subject as you go through it, that tends to be quite good for your long-term retention. Something else that's good for long-term retention is testing yourself, challenging yourself in different ways, and also asking questions to really understand as much as you can about the material you're learning. So those are some really useful strategies to help you train your brain more effectively. Then we've got the fundamentals. The fundamentals are the things that you just need to do in general for your life, but they also have the byproduct of helping you become smarter, right? These are things like get enough sleep, things like exercise regularly, right? Things like eat healthy, balanced diet, omega-3 fatty acids, mindfulness and meditation and resting and whatnot. Things like learning. And they found that learning music, right? Musical learning or language learning, continuous learning of that kind of nature tends to help you to become smarter overall. So learning a new language, learning a musical instrument actually improves your overall intelligence as well, which is, I think, quite cool. And also social interaction is good for your ability to learn. There's a guy called Vygotsky, he's this old sort of psychologist, Russian psychologist, and he had this thing called the zone of proximal development. And he talked about this notion that there's sort of a gap between what you can do, what your potential says you can do, and what you can do with help, right? The help of a mentor, the help of a guardian or whatnot. The point is that a lot of times our knowledge or our intelligence is actually a construct of conversations we have. It's a social experience we have. And whether or not you agree 100% with that, the research does tend to show that the more we socially develop ourselves, the better that is for our intelligence. And remember, that also provides us with opportunities to have conversations with others, which allows us to become smarter as a result. We now get to one of my favorites, which is number 4, which is what I call the 4 questions of contextualizing intelligence. And these are 4 questions that allow you to be able to ensure that you are, if in fact, becoming smarter in the way that you want to be smarter. Remember we talked earlier about being smarter, about how you're becoming smarter? Well, these are 4 questions will help you to do that. The first of the questions are, what do you want to become smarter at? What do you want to become smarter at? You have to identify specifically what you want to become smarter at. The next question then is, what are the core skills that you'll need to be smarter at that? So the core skills, the core abilities that would let you become smarter at that. Next, what do you need to practice in order to become really good at those skills? And then finally, when will you do this? So very simple, straightforward, but very powerful. What do you want to become smarter at? What skills do you need to be smarter at that? What do you need to practice to work on those skills? And when will you do that? When you answer those 4 questions, you'll be giving yourself the specific actions and behaviors that you need to engage in consistently to become smarter in that area. And possibly even smarter than anybody else. Or at least anybody else that you might be comparing yourself to, maybe. And then finally, we have thinking smarter. This is number 5. And with thinking smarter, I'm really talking about what I believe is the most under-indexed and underappreciated of all the things you can do to improve how smart you are. This is something that I spend a lot of time in because I look in the area of what we call belief leadership, which is your ability to cultivate beliefs in what's worth believing in and to be able to change the beliefs that might limit you or hold you back. And so the first thing about thinking smarter is we really need to identify what our cognitive biases are. These are the sort of the The things that trip us up, the habits, the habitual heuristics or shortcuts that we have in our mind. Things like what we call confirmation bias, where we look for evidence to prove our conclusions are true, and we dismiss evidence that contradicts them, right? The things that hold us back because we're only listening to what we want to listen to. The Dunning-Kruger effect, the concept or idea that the smarter we think we are, the less we probably know. The overconfidence bias, where we're more likely to be overconfident of our answers because maybe we were right in the past. But as a result of that, we fail to think critically in that way. And then finally, the availability bias, where we're more likely to overvalue how important something is simply because we see it everywhere. And these kind of effects and these kind of biases can steer us wrong. So the more you're aware of it, the more you can recognize these different kinds of biases and challenge them, the more likely you will be to be able to think more critically and as a result make better decisions. Now, when you're making better decisions, you also want to reflect on how you decide and make sure you have a consistent way of making decisions that is using rationale and using reasoning in the most effective way. You want to recognize when your emotions are trying to move you aside, not just listen to your emotions, thinking your emotions are the guide. Sometimes when you think you're listening to your emotions, you're not doing it. And we've talked about that on a previous episode. Sometimes when you say, oh, I'm listening to my gut, and you're thinking to yourself, this is just like the force. I'm listening to the force. You're not listening to the force. You listen to your emotions. And your emotions might be like clever, full of wisdom, or they might just be absolute nut jobs. So before you listen to your emotions, you got to figure out which is which. And you can't listen to your gut as to which is which. Because again, remember the nut jobs. The other thing that you can do is to enhance your critical reasoning skills, to begin to improve your ability to be more logical, to debate better, to analyze things, to evaluate things, to train that part of your brain that challenges and looks for the contrary information. Try to look for the things that make you wrong. The more comfortable you are at being wrong, the more you look to become wrong, the better it will be. And the more you apply this to actual real life scenarios, as opposed to abstract exercises, the more you apply it to the real life world that you live in, the more likely you are to start to cement it as a natural part of your way of thinking. Remember, what you're doing here is you're building neural pathways in the brain. And the more you practice it and the more you make it specific, the more those pathways will serve you and will make your brain even more efficient. So if I was to summarize everything we've talked about, where does this leave us? Well, number one, you need to believe in your ability to improve your intelligence and build that growth mindset and believe that you can and will and are becoming smarter. Number two, you need to contextualize. Understand, how do you want to become smarter? What skills will you need to become smarter? What behaviors will lead to those skills? And when are you going to engage in those behaviors? You need to get the fundamentals right. You got to eat right. You got to sleep right. You got to exercise right. You got to maybe practice mindfulness or meditation if you can. But you got to take care of yourself and learn music, learn new languages, just consistently learn. You got to practice the skills that will help you to become smarter. And finally, you need to work in your critical thinking. You need to think critically, bruh. You know what I'm talking about? And so if you do all of those things, you will find yourself becoming so much more successful. And you will find yourself able to become smart where it counts. You don't need to be able to do a Rubik's Cube. You don't need to be able to figure everything out. You don't need to be able to win every single game. You just need to become smarter in a way that works for you. And one of the things that would make you smarter is to make sure that you're subscribed to this podcast. Make sure you rate and review it. Make sure you share it with everyone you can possibly think about. Make sure you sign up for my newsletter, owenfitzpatrick.com/newsletter. I guess that'll make you smart. It's a very smart decision to make. You'll subscribe to my YouTube channel. You'll follow me on social media. All those things, I believe, are super smart decisions. But if you don't do any of those, it doesn't mean you're done. But for now, take care. Hope you found this useful. Excited to see you very soon for another episode of the Changing Minds podcast. I'm Owen Fitzpatrick. Thank you very much for listening. Practice being smarter, believe better, and may the force as always be with you.